Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Welcome to historic London Town and Gardens. I'm happy to welcome all of you here and welcome Dr. Blyden for today's lecture. This is the second in our winter lecture series. The theme this year, of course, is focusing on the African American experience in the Chesapeake. A couple announcements before we get started. This afternoon, if you haven't heard, is the Big Read, Anne Arundel County's Big Read. We're being joined by the conversation starters. The book that is being focused on in the entire county is The Big Smoke. It's a collection of poems about the boxer Jack Johnson. There are free copies of the book up front. You may have seen a stack of books up there. Those are free. That's part of the Big Read. Help yourself to one of those. Give it a read. Come on back. 2 o'clock this afternoon, we're going to have a discussion of the book downstairs in our exhibit. If you have a ticket to the lecture, your ticket is also good for the Big Read this afternoon. So come on back and join the conversation starters. Also, our next lecture, next Saturday, is Brenda Parker. She's the lead African American interpreter at George Washington's Mount Vernon. She'll be talking about how we teach history in a public history setting, how we can teach African American history at historic places like London Town and George Washington's Mount Vernon. The final speaker in the lecture series is Janice Hayes Williams. She's with the County Executive's Office, and she'll be talking about the importance and the impact of African American history, what it does for the people in our region, in Annapolis and Anne Arundel County. There are a couple of programs coming up next month. Last weekend of March is Maryland Day. We join a lot of historic sites in the Four Rivers Heritage Area, historic Annapolis, the Maryland State Archives. We're open all weekend long. It's sort of the kickoff for our season. So come on back for the last weekend of March for Maryland Day. In June, on June 22nd, we're having our Uncertain Freedom 1864 program. Some of you may have gotten to see that last year. It was in September. We're moving it to June. June 22nd is Uncertain Freedom. We're joined by African American interpreters from across the country and internationally. We had a couple fly in from Dublin, Ireland last year to join us. And they explore the lives of African Americans free and enslaved as the institution of slavery is collapsing in Maryland. We also invite you to check out our website. We, as I mentioned last weekend, are introducing a new temporary exhibit on the slave trade to London Town. And that panel, that exhibit panel, will be out in the front room on Saturday. So in 1 week, we'll have a new exhibit panel up front introducing you to the history of the slave trade to London Town. And our website, we've got a preview of that, historiclondontown.org/UNESCO. So come on back and check that out. Your admission, of course, helps us to keep these exciting programmings going and telling important stories. And if you are a member, thank you. If not, consider becoming a member. That's free admission for a full year, discounted admission to special programs, special after-hours programs. There's all kinds of benefits that you get, and it really helps us to stay afloat and to do what we do. So do consider a membership. I'd like to now welcome Dr. Nemata Blyden. She's an associate professor of history at George Washington University. She specializes in African and African diaspora history. She's got a new book coming out. You may have seen a preview of that on the table up front. If you haven't, go take a look. She just showed me the cover. It looks great. It's African Americans and Africa: A New History. It's coming from Yale University Press. So check that out. So again, please join me in welcoming Dr. Blyden as she presents In Slavery and Freedom, Sierra Leone's Ties to the Americas.
Thank you, Kyle. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Everybody, thank you. It's 10 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday, so I really appreciate you coming out to hear what I have to say. And thank you very much, Kyle and London Town, for having me. So Kyle asked me to talk a little bit about Sierra Leone's connection to the Americas because there's some indication that perhaps a slave ship from Sierra Leone might have made its way to this London Town area. So I thought I would share a little bit about what I know about Sierra Leone's ties to the Americas. Okay. So Sierra Leone, for those of you who may not know, is a small West African country about 4 million people, slightly smaller than the state of South Carolina. And it's a small country in size, but very important in the story of Atlantic, diaspora, African American history. When we think about the connections between America, the United States, and Africa, we think of Liberia. But Sierra Leone also has very close ties to the United States. Its history is linked to the abolition of the slave trade, to British history, to American history, to Caribbean history. I'm going to focus on its ties to American history for purposes of this talk. So the first connections that Sierra Leone has to the United States is, of course, in the story of enslavement and the slave trade, right? We know that many Africans who were enslaved in the United States came from West Africa, and some of them might have come, well, we know not might have, many of them came from Sierra Leone. So here what I have here, this is more for me than for you. Here what I have is a breakdown of the regions from which people came, from West Africa, from Africa that people came, who ended up in the United States. So 90%, historians believe that about 90% of Africans from the Senegambia region, the Senegambia region is in that area of West Africa, if you know your map of Africa, that is today Senegal and Mali, Senegal, Gambia, Guinea-Bissau, Mali, the Upper Guinea coast, which includes Sierra Leone and Guinea, the Gold Coast, which is today Ghana, the Bight Baby or Biafra in what is today Nigeria, Cameroon, and West Central Africa, Angola, Congo, DRC. So that whole stretch of the continent in the west, from say about Mauritania down to Angola. So we have a sense of where people came from. We can also break down the regional origins of Africans arriving in the United States from Sierra Leone. It's estimated that about just a little under 45,000 ended up in this region that we're talking about today, to the United States, and then to about 3,749 to the Chesapeake Tidewater region. So we know that people from Sierra Leone ended up in this space that we're talking about today. Bunce Island is the slave fort that exists in Sierra Leone, we know that people who ended up in the Atlantic world were taken from. We most popularly know the slave trade forts in Ghana and Senegal, Gorée Island, Cape Coast, Elmina Castle. Those are the slave forts that in history we talk about most commonly. Bunce Island, that's located in Sierra Leone, was also a very important site from which Africans were taken in the slave trade. And this is the image of Bunce Island. As it might have looked, it was a British fort. And as it looks today, and there's been some move in the last couple of years by scholars by historians and archaeologists to sort of reconstruct Bunce Island and make it a tourist site in the way that others are. So the first connections, one of the earliest connections that we talk about with respect to the connection between the United States and Sierra Leone is the story of the Black Loyalists. Who are the Black Loyalists? Black Loyalists were slaves, enslaved people in the United States who, when the American Revolution broke out, fought on the side of the British. Right? So as Americans rebelled against the British said to enslaved Africans, if you fight on our side, we will give you your freedom. And true to their word, they did give freedom to those Africans who fought on their side. Some of them at the end of the war were taken to England, but a large group was also settled in Nova Scotia, Canada. So when we talk about the Nova Scotians, we talk about a group of formerly enslaved Africans who ended up in Nova Scotia, Canada, who, once they got there, were dissatisfied with the conditions and petitioned the British government to take them back to Africa. So in 1792, about 1,200 or so Black Loyalists, they called Black Loyalists because obviously they fought on the side of the British, about 1,200 of them were repatriated and settled in Sierra Leone. So they become one of the earliest groups from the United States who settled in Sierra Leone in 1792. They were led by this man called Thomas Peters. Thomas Peters was a former slave from Wilmington, North Carolina, who fought for the British and was freed. And there were several like him. I have my students in my class this semester reading a wonderful book by an Afro-Canadian author called Lawrence Hill. And the book is called Someone Knows My Name. And if you're ever looking for good fiction to read, pick it up. And it's the story of a little girl who was enslaved and brought to the Americas, enslaved on a plantation in the South, but who goes back as part of this black loyalist move back to Africa. It's a beautiful story. David George was another one of the black loyalists who fought on the side of the British. He was born in Virginia, enslaved on a plantation in Virginia, ran away to South Carolina and Georgia, captured by Creek Indians. So these people have these vibrant life histories. But he was again re-enslaved in Georgia and took the opportunity when it was given by the British to join the cause and was given his freedom, evacuated to Nova Scotia, and ended up in Sierra Leone. We actually have the first words that David George writes when he sees the shoreline of Sierra Leone, and he says something like, I'm paraphrasing, "It is wonderful to see the land of my parents." So here's a statue of Thomas Peters. So Thomas Peters now has become an icon in Sierra Leone. So as you can see from these images here, in 2011, a statue was erected in Sierra Leone. So this statue is actually in Sierra Leone of Thomas Peters, this former slave from North Carolina who ended up in Africa, has a statue now in his honor in this small West African nation. So Sierra Leone, just briefly, was colonized by the British. So in 1808, it became a crown colony, and various groups of repatriated blacks, like the Nova Scotians, some repatriated blacks from the Caribbean, some repatriated blacks from England, were settled into this colony and was governed by the British beginning in 1808. So it's this really vibrant cultural mix of people from different parts of the Atlantic world of African descent, mixing in with local indigenous African populations, being governed by the British. And so you see here some images of what the colony might have looked like. There's a chapel, and of course, the British sought to so-called civilize these people, right, by Christianizing them. So churches were erected, schools were erected, and you'll see a little bit more of that in a minute. And so here's a representation of what the colony might have looked like in the 19th century, as designed by the British. Another group of African Americans who made their way to Sierra Leone were led by a man called Paul Cuffey. Paul Cuffey was a wealthy African American merchant from New England. He was born in New England, who in 1816 brought with him about 38 African American settlers to settle in Sierra Leone. And he brought them intending to bring more of them, but he died before that was possible. So 38 settlers were settled in Sierra Leone at the urging of Paul Cuffey. And here's his cemetery here. He's buried in New Bedford, Massachusetts, I think. And that's another way by which African Americans made their way to Sierra Leone. And then we have others who come independently, independent of the slave trade, independent of any connection to slavery. And these are people I like to talk about a lot in my lectures about the connection between Sierra Leone and the United States, because these are people who are forgotten in African American history. Maybe if I said Daniel Coker, somebody might know who he is, but Edward Jones, who I'll say a little bit about, is virtually unknown to African Americans and African American history. And I see it in my job to change that. Daniel Coker was a teacher in Baltimore. He was born in Baltimore. I believe his mother was enslaved and gained her freedom. But Daniel Coker was the co-founder of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the AME Zion Church. We all know who Richard Allen is, right? The founder of the AME Zion Church is Richard Allen. But it was co-founded with Daniel Coker, and we tend to forget that. And that's because Daniel Coker left the United States in 1820 and ended up in Sierra Leone. He settled in Sierra Leone in 1820. Another person who we don't know much about when we talk about African American history here is a man by the name of Edward Jones. Fascinating. Why there isn't a whole book about him, I don't know. But he was born free in Charleston. He was born a free man in Charleston. His father was a wealthy hotelier by the name of J.B. Jones, who had a hotel that catered only to white Americans in Charleston, South Carolina. And in 1826, he sent his son off to the north, right? Obviously, there were no colleges that would accept a free black man in the South, so he sent his son up to the north. And Edward Jones became the first black graduate of an all-white institution, Amherst College, in 1826. He graduated in 1826. Again, his possibilities were limited here, so he went off to Africa as a missionary and went to Sierra Leone in 1831, where he lived out the rest of his life as a missionary and a teacher, and became the first black principal of an institution that still exists in Sierra Leone called Frobby College. It was the first institution of higher learning in sub-Saharan Africa, and that's the original building of Frobby College. And Edward Jones led that institution until he died in the 1860s or the 1870s. Fascinating story. This is a connection that a lot of people know about, the Amistad connection, right? The 1839 shipboard revolt of Africans who were enslaved. On their way to Cuba, they revolted, took over the ship, forced the ship's captain to take them back to Africa. They thought ended up on the coastline of New York. It resulted in a huge court case in New Haven, Connecticut. The enslaved Africans were defended by the former president of the United States, John Quincy Adams, in a famous trial, and it resulted in the captives being freed and sent back home. Right? So this is a connection between the United States and Sierra Leone that a lot of people don't, again, know about in terms of its connection to Sierra Leone, because once they return to Sierra Leone, their stories sort of get lost. The leader of the revolt was a man by the name of Senge Pierre, or Joseph Cinque, and he was responsible for taking over the ship, leading the revolt on the ship, and that's a connection to Sierra Leone. A little known fact that I also like to talk about when I talk about the Amistad is that when they went back to Sierra Leone, to this British colony, the person who was heading the colonial government at that time was an African descended man from the Caribbean by the name of William Ferguson. So all of these connections between Sierra Leone and the diaspora of the Caribbean and the United States can also be told in the story of the Amistad. And here's a quote by an 11-year-old Amistad captive. When they were in the jail cells in New Haven, because they were held in jail cells during the trial, missionaries came, teachers came, and taught them to read, particularly the children, to learn English and to read. And here's a letter, once the captives were freed, written to John Quincy Adams, President John Quincy Adams, by an 11-year-old boy who was a captive on the Amistad. He says, "We were on shore, and the Americans tell us slave ship catch us. They say we make you free. If they make us free, they tell truth. If they not make us free, they tell lies. If America give us free, we glad. If they no give us free, we sorry. We sorry for Mende people, little. We sorry for America people, great deal, because God punished liars. Dear friend, we want you to know how we feel. Mende people think, nobody knows. All we want is to make us free, not send us to Havana, send us home." And I like to quote this because, again, it tells the story of the quest for freedom on the part of these African captives in the Amistad, the risk they took in mounting this shipboard revolt, the risk they took in hoping that they would be taken back to Africa is expressed, I think, very poignantly in this little boy's letter, the hope for freedom, that all enslaved Africans, regardless of what part of Africa they were taken from, sought. Another interesting connection between Sierra Leone and the United States are these travelers who came from Sierra Leone who visited the United States. Beginning in the 19th century, we have these stories of individual Sierra Leoneans who made their way to the United States, not as a result of the slave trade, not in any kind of coerced fashion, but as these visitors. And this is a period when there's a sort of an interest in Africa, sort of as a curiosity. And so the 19th century also brought Africans coming to the United States to study to become missionaries, to go back to civilize, right, and to Christianize Africa from the perspective of Europeans. And one of these visitors was a man by the name of Jacob Paisley, who traveled around the United States in the 1870s and the 1880s, giving lectures about Africa, right? So these were the beginning of stories that we could tell about Africans who are teaching Americans about where they come from, teaching Americans about Africa. And so the Cleveland Gazette in 1882, writing about one of his lectures, says that Jacob Hazley gave us many new ideas relative to African manners, customs, and productions. He showed that Africa is a vast continent abounding in enormous wealth, both mineral and vegetable, that the African is susceptible to as much culture as any race enjoys, and that it is only a question of time when Africa should be one of the grandest continents on the globe in every respect, right? So again, saying, we as Africans have a civilization, we have a history, we have a culture, teaching African Americans, but also white Americans about Africa, in this case, Sierra Leone. He ended up dying in New Orleans in 1887, while he was on a visit here. Another visitor, I won't get to her in a minute. And we also have a story of African American missionaries going to Africa, right? So the 19th century is a period when missionaries from Europe, from the United States, are going again. This notion of Africa needing uplift, needing civilization, needing Christianization is part of the missionary ethos. And many white Americans, of course, go to Africa as missionaries, but also black Americans go. And so again, we have all of these stories of black Americans going to Africa as missionaries. Two missionaries who went to Sierra Leone are Joseph and Mary Loma, who went with the United Brethren Mission to Sierra Leone in the 1870s, and again settled in Sierra Leone, living there for most of their lives, actually, as missionaries in Sierra Leone. Africans also came to the United States to train as missionaries, right? So not only did missionaries from the United States go, mission organizations trained Africans to go back to do missionary work amongst their own people. And one such person was a man by the name of Daniel Wilberforce. And he, the story goes, was the son of a local Sierra Leonean couple who worked for a white missionary. And when the white missionary was returning to America, he took their son with them to come and train him, educate him. So he was educated as a teenager in the United States, returned to Sierra Leone to become a missionary. The woman who you see next to him in all the pictures, that's his wife and his children, and this is Daniel Wilberforce and his wife in old age, was actually an African American woman. So he married an African American woman, and she went back with him to settle in Sierra Leone. This is in the 1880s. So again, this connection between African Americans and the African continent. And this is the pictures of the Wilberforce family. He was of chiefly lineage, and so when he went back as a missionary, he was tapped to be a chief of the community from which he came back. And so we have these contrasting pictures of Daniel Wilberforce as looking very much like a Western missionary, and then in his chiefly outfit right there. And this is his son and his son's wife right there. Another Sierra Leonean who served as a missionary, but this time as a missionary to African Americans, was this man by the name of Orishatuke Faruna. He was born in Sierra Leone, came to study at Yale University, so he was one of the first black graduates of Yale University Divinity School. Studied to be a missionary with the intent of going back to Africa to be a missionary, like Daniel Wilberforce, but ended up staying in the United States in the post-Civil War era. He went down south to be a missionary to African Americans, right? So again, you see this circulation of relationships between African Americans and Africa. He too married an African American woman by the name of Nemata Adams from Georgia, taught at the Peabody Academy in Troy, North Carolina, and basically served as a missionary to African Americans for more than 50 years. He went back to Africa, to Sierra Leone briefly in 1913, but returned and lived the rest of his life in the United States and died in North Carolina in 1946. So again, this connection between Sierra Leone and the United States. One interesting character, many of you know about the Garvey movement, Marcus Garvey, the Jamaican who during the 1920s was one of the most famous, you can call him a black American, he lived in the United States, who called for a back to Africa movement. He was responsible for rallying African Americans to seek repatriation in the United States. So most of us know about Marcus Garvey. I'm here to tell you about a man named George Mark, who was from Sierra Leone, who was a right-hand man to Marcus Garvey during the early 20th century, the 1900s, served as a sort of almost like a vice president, if you will, in the UNIA, the Universal Negro Improvement Association, which was Garvey's organization. And he served as a deputy potentate, was his title. And here's a description of him in a newspaper. George Mark, who was formerly the chief clerk of Freetown, Sierra Leone, West Africa, sat in majesty wearing a black uniform, liberally splashed with gold braid and a cockade hat covering almost as much feathered as that of his chief. The crowd received from him the gracious smiles and condescending bows which had been withheld from them by the Supreme Potentate himself. Marcus Garvey is known for these elaborate parades where they would dress up in, sort of almost military wear. And this article is describing George Mark dressed in that way. You see him in the picture right there next to Marcus Garvey. You see him sitting right next to Marcus Garvey there and standing over there, not so fancily dressed. But he had been a member of the Garvey movement in Sierra Leone before he came to the United States and traveled to the United States expressly to meet Marcus Garvey and to work in his organization. The Garvey movement was very vibrant in the United States, but it was also very vibrant in parts of Africa. So Sierra Leone, from which George Mark came, already had a UNIA branch before he came to the United States. A sort of small anecdote about George Mark is that he fell out with Marcus Garvey in the 1920s and actually sued Marcus Garvey for back pay. I don't know if he ever got that money, but he did do that and died in the United States in Brooklyn in 1926. So I'm talking about all men, right? So you would think that the only connection is between men. We do have some stories. It's harder, of course, to reconstruct the lives of women and to get at the experiences of women. But we do have the story of Adelaide Casey Hayford, who was also from Sierra Leone, who also had a connection to the Garvey movement. So she, in fact, was president of the ladies division of the UNIA in Sierra Leone. In the 1920s, she made a series of fundraising trips to the United States to raise money. She wanted to build a school for girls in Sierra Leone. So she did this wonderful tour in the 1920s to talk about Sierra Leone again, to talk about the school that she wanted to build in Sierra Leone. And so she recounts her experiences in the United States, being barred from hotels, right? This is the era of segregation, being barred from hotels in New York, being barred from sitting in specific places on trains. So here's a little quote from her about traveling to the South on a train. She says, "We traveled in a Jim Crow car, which of course could have been easily avoided had we only proclaimed our nationality to the railway officials." So she thought if she said, "I'm from Sierra Leone," she would get to sit in a non-segregated car. So again, this speaks perhaps to the lack of understanding, if you will, of the experiences of African Americans when Africans come to the United States. But she figured out that that was not true and indeed had to sit in a segregated car. And her story is also quite an interesting one. This fellow was an actor in Hollywood. He was from Sierra Leone. He came to study anthropology, so there's an article by him in a journal from the early 20th century. He came to study anthropology and ended up in the movies. His name was David Much Paris. That was the name he was given. But he took the name of Prince Modupe, sort of reinvented himself as African royalty, and became an actor, much more of an extra problem in films in the United States. And so he was supposedly born in French West Africa, maybe Guinea, but we do believe that he was actually born in Sierra Leone. All his biographies sort of craft this idea of being born in French Guinea, but I discovered, I think, that he was born in Sierra Leone, arrived in New York in 1922, participated in the Chicago World Fair, and I think that's where he got interested in this idea of acting, and made his way to Hollywood by 1935. He wrote a biography called I Was a Royal African, where he talks about his experiences growing up in Sierra Leone, being educated in Sierra Leone, and then coming to the United States, where he got into films. And here's a quote from his book. And again, many of these Africans, many of these Sierra Leoneans that I'm talking about, serve to sort of give Americans a different picture of Africa, a different way of understanding Africa. They were telling them about the places from which they came from. And here's a quote from him. The plant life around any village is highly important to the community. Our food, clothing, the roofs of our shelters, the medicines, the spices, the well-being of the people derive largely from the things that grow in the earth. The medicine man may be thought of as a specialist in roots and herbs and plants, but every individual must know the common uses of plants. Therefore, a great emphasis was placed in the Bondo schooling of the botany, and the Bondo means strength. Right, so again, this way by which Africans were serving to create a different picture of Africa. Remember, this is the early 20th century, where ideas of Africa were based on this notion of Africa as backward, as savage, right? As needing civilization, as needing Christianity. Many of these Sierra Leoneans who, when they came to the United States, wanted to change that image and to portray an image of the places from which they came as, in fact, not needing that kind of so-called civilization that was going to be brought. And these are some of the Hollywood movies. Typical stereotypical 1930s sort of movies where black characters, you know, sort of play savage natives, etc. More recent stories that have connected Africa to the United States, or that have connected Sierra Leone to the United States, is the discovery of the connection that Sierra Leone has with the Gullah people in Georgia, South Carolina, the Gullah Geechee people. Beginning in the 1980s, when an anthropologist by the name of Joe Apala and a musicologist by the name of Cynthia Smith made a series of documentaries about the connection between Sierra Leone and the United States. We now have discovered a very close connection between those two regions. We now know that Africans from Sierra Leone specifically were brought to these places because of their rice growing technique, knowledge of rice growing, and brought to work on rice plantations in South Carolina and Georgia. And so over the last 3 decades, we have actually discovered descendants of some of these scholars that have connections with Sierra Leone. And one of them was a lady by the name of Mary Moran, who I had the privilege of meeting before she died, who, based on a song that her grandmother used to sing, her grandmother taught her a song. And she thought it was just a little ditty. It turned out it was a funeral dirge. So based on this song, they were able to trace Mary Moran to a very specific village in Sierra Leone. And what the anthropologist and the musicologist did was they took a tape of her grandmother. There was a recording of her grandmother from the 1930s singing this song. And they took a recording of this and traveled in villages in Sierra Leone and having people listen to this song until they found a woman who recognized the words of the song and who knew what the song meant. And so there's a really wonderful video called The Language I Cry In that tells the story of Mary Moran going and meeting this woman in Sierra Leone. So these generations of family lost, you could say, meeting up. And so that's her story. And then more recently, a young woman by the name of Tomlin people also made a connection of a direct link to her, to Sierra Leone. And she also went to Sierra Leone in 2005. So we have now these stories of these direct connections and people from the Gullah community visiting Sierra Leone. DNA ancestry has also led to these direct connections between African Americans and Sierra Leone. Many of you probably watch Henry Louis's Gates series on, what's it called, Who Do You Think You Are, or something like that, where he traces DNA ancestry. But before that became popularized, many African Americans were doing that and finding out what their ancestry was Two famous ones, was this actor Michael Williams and the actor Isaiah Washington. And Isaiah Washington has really taken this connection to heart, as you can see from this quote. While in Sierra Leone, he says, I not only saw the faces of my family members back in Houston, Texas, but I found myself publicly pledging that I would help raise awareness of the plight of Sierra Leone. Seeing the people, he says, and the familiar terrain in Sierra Leone, I instinctively knew that this was my home, right? So this now, African Americans have a more tangible ability, if you will, through these ancestry and DNA tests to find where they come from in Africa. And some of them are taking it very seriously, as you can see from Isaiah Washington's quote right there. I think that's it. I'll take questions now and comments. Yes?
You talked about the connection between Sierra Leone and the Gullah people in South Carolina and
Yes.
Georgia. What about the Chesapeake area? Any traces of Sierra Leone ancestry here?
Well, we know, as that first slide showed you, that a number of enslaved Africans ended up in the Chesapeake area. But we know that kind of close connection that we can draw between South Carolina and Sierra Leone, I don't know that we've been able to do for areas in Maryland or Virginia. And I, and one of the reasons, I'm not a culture historian, but I think one of the reasons that we can propose for that is that in those communities, in those low South communities, places like South Carolina and Georgia, much more of African culture was retained, much more of the language was retained, so that we're able to trace those connections because we can research those languages, we can reach those cultures in a way that is harder to do for a region like the Chesapeake region. And so I would, I wouldn't say no, but those kinds of close, direct lines that we can draw for the Gullah, I'm not sure that we can do. Not yet, maybe, yes. Yes?
The early people that went back to Sierra Leone, that had fought in the Revolutionary War, how did that work out for them?
Very well. So they're an interesting kid. I love actually talking about the Nova Scotians because they go back to Sierra Leone and they settle there because they've been promised freedom, right? The whole point of fighting on the side of the British was to gain their freedom. When they got to Sierra Leone, they found themselves in a situation where they were being governed once again by the British. And they were not happy there, right? Because they had gone to Sierra Leone to craft an independent community. And so the Nova Scotians are an interesting group to look at in Sierra Leone because there's constant tension between them and the British rulers, right? Because they set up a system when they go where everybody can vote, so women could vote in Sierra Leone in the late 1830s. There was a system that had been set up where everybody could vote. So they sought that equality. And so there was a lot of tension between them and the British. So it's interesting when you're reading the correspondence of the British colonial governors back to England, the thing they hate most about the Nova Scotians is their sense of liberty, justice, and equality. And so there's this wonderful letter from a governor who's writing, complaining about the Nova Scotians. They're always asking for something. They always, they don't listen to us. They want to do their own thing. They've brought their American sense of liberty and equality. He's outraged by this notion, right? So they learn from their masters, the very masters, right, who have enslaved them, who have oppressed them, have also taught them a sense of liberty and justice, and the British don't like that. So they do very well. So Jacob Hazley, right, the African traveler, is a descendant of the Nova Scotians. So Hazley, we know to be a Nova Scotian name. So they did quite well for themselves. I mean, they were joined by others, and the Maroons came, other groups were repatriated and settled there, but they did quite well. Yes, do you have a follow-up?
When did England abolish slavery in their colonies?
England abolished slavery in their colony in 1834. So the slave trade, so Sierra Leone's history is very much connected to that. The slave trade was abolished by Britain in 1807, and then Sierra Leone, of course, becomes a colony. And so part of Sierra Leone's story is that when the British abolished the slave trade in 1807, they set themselves up as arbiters of freedom and justice, and they begin to police the seas, capturing ships trading slaves illegally. And when they captured those ships, they generally repatriated those slaves that were on board, the enslaved that were on board those ships, and many of them were settled in Sierra Leone. So there's this very close connection between the end of the slave trade and Sierra Leone's growth. Slavery itself is abolished by England not until 1834. Yes.
In terms of African Americans going back to Africa, which was a bigger draw, Sierra Leone or Liberia? Did they compete in any sense?
No, I mean Liberia definitely. So Sierra Leone, in some ways, African Americans ending up in Sierra Leone in the beginning, well not in the beginning, but at some times is sort of as a byproduct. So Daniel Coca, who I talked about, co-founder of the Anglican Church, ends up in Sierra Leone as a byproduct of the settlement of Liberia. He's on a ship that's taking the first settlers to Liberia that doesn't make it to Liberia, and he ends up staying in Sierra Leone. But there's not that kind of a connection between Sierra Leone and the United States, because Sierra Leone is a British colony. So I wouldn't say there was competition. The African Americans who ended up in Sierra Leone, like Edward Jones, and there were others I could talk about, went there on their own voluntarily. So there's a man, for example, by the name of, I can't remember his first name, but his last name was Houston. And he was an African American who just decided to go settle in Sierra Leone, and he ended up being a journalist there. He started a newspaper. And so you have these private individuals who are choosing to go to Sierra Leone. And I believe it's because they don't want that association with Liberia, but I wouldn't say that there was competition in that way. Many different spaces, yes.
You mentioned, the guy that there should be a book about.
Oh, Edward Jones.
Edward Jones.
Yes.
That should be your next book.
And let me tell you something. There was it's funny that you say that, because we had a very prominent individual who said he was a diplomat, worked at the UN, was also a professor and a medical doctor by the name of Dr. Davidson Nickel. He's actually an old family friend of ours. He wrote a small article about Edward Jones, and then in his later years as he retired, he wrote a biography of Edward Jones. And there's a professor at a university, Kennesaw University in Georgia, who tried to, we got permission from his family to try and see if we could get the manuscript published, and we just couldn't. And I worked on it and editing it, and we just could not get a publisher. Yeah, so there is actually a manuscript out there about the family, this Jones family. It's a fascinating family story. I mean, the father himself, J.B. Jones, was an amazing person, but we just could not get any publisher interested. And he may still come back and see if we could get some. So there is something.
Maybe you could go fund me and so.
There you go. You're right, this was about 10 years ago, so maybe we weren't thinking about GoFundMe back then, right? Yeah. And Edward Jones is fascinating because of the lasting legacy in Sierra Leone. Because as principal, right, first as a teacher, first he was a teacher in the Christian Missionaries, worked for the Christian Missionary Society. So many of those Africans who I just described being repatriated off of slave ships, when they were settled in Sierra Leone, were settled in villages, and every one of those villages had a CMS school, right? And Edward Jones was a teacher in those CMS schools for many, many years before he became principal. And then as principal, of course, then mentored Sierra Leonean Africans at that level, right? So long, wide reach, long lasting impact that he had. But if I say the name Edward Jones in my African American history class, no one knows who he is, which is a shame. Yes, sir.
Yeah, a number of the slaves that were sent from Sierra Leone starting over were Muslim, and then from Mali.
Yes.
Could you say a few words about that?
Yes, what we're now finding out, and I, caveat is I'm not an expert on this, but what we're now finding out is that, in fact, many enslaved Africans continue to practice Islam, continue to practice their Muslim religion. There's a bit of, there have been several interesting articles and books written about those stories. But maybe the most popular one is the story of a man by the name of Mohammed Abatwa, who, scholars now know, continued throughout his life in enslavement, even though he professed to have converted to Christianity, to continue to practice Islam. And that's true, and we know that's true certainly in Brazil, why not in the United States as well, so we do know that. Because documents have been found with Quranic scripts inside, Bibles with Quranic scripts inside, right? With people who are continuing to practice, and they continue to practice their traditional religion, why not Islam if they can convert it? And we do know that significant number of Muslims were captured and enslaved in the Americas. Yes.
The black loyalists who
Yes.
went to Nova Scotia,
Mm-hmm.
did most of them stay or most of them go to?
No, most of them stayed. The number that we tend to sort of cite for Sierra Leone is about 1,200. So it's a small number, but most of them stayed. I couldn't give you off the top of my head a number of them ended up in Nova Scotia, but most of them stayed in Nova Scotia. The ones that ended up in Sierra Leone are just a small, which I find to be the interesting story because, these were men and women who said, we've given you this, we fought for you, we've done what we promised, you do for us what you promised. And if you're gonna settle us in Nova Scotia and not give us, because remember, white loyalists were also settled, right? Whites who fought on the side of the British also evacuated to Nova Scotia. If you're going to treat us differently from the white loyalists, then we don't want to be here, we want to leave. And so Thomas Peters, people like David George said, we want to go. Yes, sir.
The loyalists that were sent to Nova Scotia and settled in a part of Nova Scotia, which is all rocks.
Exactly.
And you couldn't farm there.
Right.
And they're expected, after a few years, to start farming and taking care of them.
Exactly.
So, the town, I think it's Sherwood, or Sherwood.
Yeah, something like
It's a
that.
ghost town.
Yes.
With streets, laid out
Mhm.
like a city,
Mhm.
and no one lives there.
Yeah.
And maybe 1,000
Yeah,
people, no
yeah.
one knows.
Yeah, and so that's what they were escaping, they didn't feel that they could
That's
settle.
sort of the British street anyway.
Well, let's not get started on the British. Lots to say there, right? Anyone else?
Thank you.